April 12th, 1945. In a cramped Senate office thick with cigar smoke and the musty smell of old legislation, Harry Truman shuffled through paperwork he didn't care about. Outside, Washington's spring air carried whispers of a war that seemed, finally, to be turning. But inside that room, time moved differently, slow, heavy, like he'd been forgotten by the world. Truman loosened his tie, checked his watch, wondered quietly if anyone would ever remember his name. He had no idea that in less than 3 hours he would become the most powerful man on earth. And he had absolutely no idea what waited inside a manila folder marked S1, a secret so enormous it would force him to decide whether any human being should ever hold this much power. But before we open that folder, there's something you need to understand, because Harry Truman was never supposed to be here. This isn't a story about politics. It's not even really a story about war. It's a story about what happens when an ordinary man is handed an impossible choice, and history refuses to take the weight back. The Oval Office smelled different than Truman expected. Later, he would say it smelled like Roosevelt, old books, pipe tobacco, and something harder to name. Legacy, maybe, or grief. They rushed him through those doors. Reporters shouted questions he couldn't process. His wife Bess was lost somewhere in the chaos of the White House. Henry Stimson was waiting, 77 years old, gaunt, eyes that had seen too many wars. He held a leather briefcase and his hands were shaking, not from age, from what was inside. "Mr. President," Stimson said. Truman flinched at the title. "There's something you need to know, something President Roosevelt never told you." The folder hit the desk. It sounded wrong, too heavy for paper. Inside were words Truman had never seen together: uranium, fission, weapon, apocalyptic yield. He read slowly, his finger tracing each line as if touching the words could make them less real. Scientists in the New Mexico desert were building something that could end the war in a single flash, or end everything. Estimated deaths from one bomb, 100,000 souls, maybe more, evaporated in seconds. Truman looked up at Stimson. "Does it work?" Stimson's silence was the answer. They didn't know yet, but they would know soon. And when they did, Truman would have to decide whether to use it. To understand why him, we have to go back. Back before Washington, before the war, before anyone thought Harry Truman mattered. Independence, Missouri, 1902. 18-year-old Harry stood barefoot in his father's fields at sunrise, the black Missouri soil cool beneath his feet. Wire-rimmed glasses perched on his nose. The other boys called him Four Eyes. A copy of Plutarch's Lives tucked under his arm. The hired hands laughed at the boss's bookish son. His father, John Truman, livestock dealer, gambler, temper like summer lightning, didn't laugh. He just shook his head. "Books won't make you a man, Harry," he said. "Get your hands dirty. Feel the world." And Harry did. He worked those fields until his hands cracked and bled, but at night, he still read. Caesar, Marcus Aurelius, men who carried the weight of empires, men forced to choose between terrible options. Was he preparing for something even then? Or was he just a farm boy who loved ancient history? Kansas City, 1919. The haberdashery at 104 West 12th Street caught the morning light just perfectly. Shirts, ties, fine hats with silk bands. For 2 glorious years, Harry Truman was a success. He'd measure a man for a collar, talk about the weather, about France, about the war they'd both survived, about the bright future ahead. When Bess would visit, he'd straighten his own tie like a nervous schoolboy, even though they'd known each other since they were 6. The shop smelled like starch and fresh cotton and possibility. Then the recession hit like a freight train. Fast, brutal, merciless. Sales dried up. Bills piled high. By 1922, the shop was shuttered. Dreams folded up like the unsold shirts gathering dust in the back room. Truman was 38 years old, broke, ashamed. So what does a failed haberdasher do? If you're Harry Truman, you make a decision that feels insane. You go into politics. Tom Pendergast ran Kansas City like a conductor runs an orchestra. Every instrument playing his tune, every note exactly where he wanted it. Votes for jobs, jobs for loyalty, loyalty for power. The machine was corrupt down to its bones. Everyone knew it. But Pendergast saw something in Truman. Maybe his honesty, maybe his desperation, maybe just a useful face for a rigged game. "I'll make you a county judge," Pendergast said over whiskey in a back room that reeked of smoke and sweat. "You do right by the people and you do right by me." Truman shook his hand. That handshake would follow him for years. They called him the senator from Pendergast, whispered that he was bought and paid for. But here's the part history struggles with. Truman took Pendergast's help and then governed honestly anyway. He built roads without graft, hired on merit, went home to Bess every night with a clear conscience, sleeping clean inside a dirty system. Was it compromise? Was it survival? Or was he learning something deeper? That purity is rare in this world, and sometimes you have to walk through mud to build something solid? The Senate chamber in 1944 was full of giants. Roosevelt, Churchill, Stalin, men whose names would fill history books, whose faces would be carved in stone. And then there was Harry Truman, the vice presidential nominee, a placeholder, a Midwestern nobody chosen because he offended no one. In 82 days as vice president, Truman met with Roosevelt exactly twice. Twice. They didn't discuss the war. They didn't discuss strategy. They certainly didn't discuss the Manhattan Project. Roosevelt, dying by inches, kept his secrets close. So when that phone call came on April 12th, when Eleanor Roosevelt's voice cracked as she said, "Harry, the president is dead," Truman wasn't ready. Nobody thought he could fill those shoes. Not the press, not Congress, not even his own mother. She told him straight, "Now you behave yourself." As if he were still a boy who might track mud on history's carpet. The summer of 1945 tasted like ash and waiting. Germany had fallen. Hitler dead in his bunker. Europe in ruins. But Japan fought on with a ferocity that terrified American commanders. Kamikaze pilots diving into ships. Suicide charges on Pacific Islands. Civilians training to fight with bamboo spears. Intelligence estimates for invading Japan's mainland. 1 million American casualties. Maybe more, maybe much more. Truman sat in cabinet meetings where gray-haired generals showed him maps painted red with predicted bloodshed. He read letters from mothers who'd already lost sons, pleading for it to end. At night, alone in the residence, he'd stand at the window looking at nothing, feeling the weight of those million lives pressing on his chest like a physical thing. And in his desk drawer, S1, use the bomb, and the war ends tomorrow. Don't use it, and something far worse might begin. Something no one could take back. July 16th, 1945. The Trinity test site in New Mexico. A flash of light brighter than 1,000 suns turned night into noon, rolled across the desert like God's own fury. Scientists watching from 10 miles away fell to their knees. J. Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the bomb, whispered words from Hindu scripture. "Now I am become death, destroyer of worlds." The shock wave rattled windows and houses 100 miles away. The mushroom cloud rose 8 miles high, and in its terrible beauty the world changed forever. Word reached Truman at the Potsdam Conference in Germany. It works. The question was no longer theoretical. The bomb was real. The power was real. And the choice was his alone. But here's what haunted Truman more than the numbers, more than the strategic calculations. It was a letter. Among thousands of documents, intelligence briefings, military assessments, there was a simple letter from a soldier who'd survived Okinawa. His handwriting was shaky, like a child's. Mr. President, it said, I don't want to die on a beach in Japan. I want to see my son grow up. Please, sir, end this. Truman folded that letter and put it in his pocket. He carried it for days. Because that's what the choice really was, wasn't it? Not abstract strategy, not geopolitics. It was that soldier. It was his son. It was 100,000 Japanese civilians who would never see tomorrow. It was the 1,000,000 Americans who might die in an invasion. How do you weigh souls? How do you decide whose child matters more? Who gets to play God? Bess found him on the Truman balcony one night in late July, his shoulders bent like an old man's, though he was only 61. Harry, she said softly, the way she'd said his name for 40 years. He didn't turn around. They want an answer, he said. Stimson, the Joint Chiefs, everyone. They want me to decide. The night was humid, thick, the kind of heat that makes everything feel slower, heavier. What would you do? He asked. Bess was quiet for a long time. Then, I'd do what you think is right. And then I'd live with it, because that's what we do. She went inside. Truman stayed there in the darkness. And somewhere between the stars and the silence, he made his choice. August 6, 1945, 8:15 in the morning. Hiroshima. A city waking up to Monday. Office workers drinking tea, children walking to school. A mother hanging laundry, her hands wet, thinking about dinner. Then, light, heat beyond description, the air itself turning to flame. In an instant, 70,000 people ceased to exist. The mushroom cloud rose, visible for miles, and underneath it, a city became a shadow. 3 days later, Nagasaki. Another flash. Another 40,000 souls. And then, on August 15th, Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled over radios across Japan, speaking publicly for the first time in history. The war was over. Truman never apologized. In public, he said he'd do it again to save American lives. He said it was a military decision, a strategic necessity, the only way to end the war quickly. But his private diary tells a different story. Years later, alone with his thoughts, he wrote, I could not bring myself to order the slaughter of another 100,000 people. He stopped using the bomb. Even when generals recommended it in Korea when the pressure mounted to use nuclear weapons again, Truman said no. He'd carried the weight of that decision for years, and it had changed him. He knew what it cost. Not just the lives lost in those Japanese cities, but something deeper. The knowledge that humans now had the power to end everything, and he'd been the first to use it. The thing about Harry Truman that we forget now, looking back through decades of history books and documentaries, is how ordinary he seemed. He wasn't eloquent like Kennedy. He wasn't charismatic like Roosevelt. He played piano decently, walked briskly every morning, loved his wife fiercely, cursed like a Missouri mule skinner when he was angry. He was short, wore thick glasses, had a Midwestern twang that Washington elites mocked. When he left office in 1953, his approval rating was 22%. 22. He went home to Independence, to the same small house on North Delaware Street, and lived there quietly with Bess. No Secret Service pension in those days. No speaking fees. Just an old man who'd been president, walking to the post office, tipping his hat to neighbors, trying to forget the weight of what he'd carried. But here's what time revealed. Truman's ordinariness was exactly what made him extraordinary. He never wanted to be president. He didn't seek glory. He just tried to do what he thought was right, even when every choice was impossible. The Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe, the Berlin airlift that saved a city, the desegregation of the military, the recognition of Israel, and yes, the bomb. All of it came from a man who started as a failed haberdasher, who was dismissed and underestimated, who never pretended to be more than he was. In 1959, a reporter asked the elderly Truman if he ever regretted dropping the atomic bombs. The old man's eyes, still sharp behind those thick glasses, fixed on the journalist. The room went quiet. You could hear the clock ticking on the mantel, hear Truman's breath, slow and steady. Young man, he said finally, when you have to make a decision like that, you make it and you move on. You don't look back. You can't. Because if you do, it'll destroy you. He paused. and for just a moment something flickered across his face. Pain, maybe, or memory. I did what I thought was right with the information I had. That's all any man can do. Harry S. Truman died on December 26th in the year 1972 at age 88 in the same Kansas City where he'd once sold shirts and failed at business and learned what it meant to lose. Bess was there holding his hand like she'd held it for 53 years of marriage. The world had changed beyond recognition since that April day in 1945 when he'd become president. The atomic age he'd begun had brought the Cold War, the space race, a perpetual shadow of annihilation hanging over humanity. But it had also brought 77 years without global war. 77 years where that terrible weapon stayed holstered, a threat, but never again a reality. Was that Truman's legacy? The man who used the bomb and then taught us never to use it again? The truth is, we're still living with Harry Truman's choice. Every day that nuclear weapons exist but aren't used is, in some way, an echo of that summer in 1945. The lesson isn't that Truman was right or wrong. Historians will debate that forever, and maybe they should. The lesson is simpler and harder. Sometimes history chooses ordinary people for impossible moments, and they have to decide with imperfect information and tremendous pressure, and no guarantee they're doing the right thing. They have to carry weights that would crush most of us. And then they have to live with it. That manila folder marked S1, the one that landed on Truman's desk those first terrible hours of his presidency, it contained more than just scientific secrets. It contained a question that every generation since has had to answer. What do we do with the power to destroy ourselves? How do we live in a world where one person's decision can end everything? Truman didn't ask for that burden. He didn't want it. But when it came, he didn't run from it either. He made his choice, carried his weight, and went home to independence. Maybe that's all any of us can do when history demands an answer.